Hello, everyone. I'm going to do a short presentation on a subject that's been of interest to me for a very long time, and I'm excited to share this with you. So, it's coming from a place of thinking about how we understand music, how we study music from other places, especially, and also how to analyze music, I guess is the best way to put it. So, there's something that it's, in a simple way to put it, there's something that has occurred with music scholars, especially, and that is, especially from the United States and Europe, where there's been this tendency to zoom in the pursuit to examine and understand music, and to focus on musical sound and or the musical score, and sometimes to the expense of anything that might surround that music making or even be a meaningful counterpart or an important dimension of both musical creation and the reception of musical sounds and arrangements. And as we have been learning about, certainly ethnomusicology has addressed this problem quite a bit and encouraging music scholars to also consider the context, not just the history or the lineage of influences on music and the individual composers, but to think about how music is used, what it might mean to certain communities. What I'm going to also pull in today now with this presentation is how do we deal with components of music performance or music creation that has other dimensions, and in particular, body movement or dance. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here to help me with this. So there is, let's see if, there we go. There is this field that has been developing that is looking at ways to combine studying the relationship between music and dance, where we don't favor one or the other, but we also look at what this relationship means. Some of these scholars are going to come from the dance end of things, and others from music, and others who have really devoted themselves to the combined phenomenon here. And so this is this term, and as you'll see, there are many terms that have been grappled with, but this is one called choreomusical analysis, and this is something I want us to think about. So this would be just an introduction to ideas that have been presented to scholarly communities by people who advocate for this kind of inquiry. Some of the ideas that I'm going to share with you today have come from this article. It's a very easy to read article, and it's a great introduction to what some of these perspectives have been. And this article actually appears in the journal The World of Music, and it was based on a conference that people came together and grappled with some of these issues. So just to introduce you to some terms, should you begin to read about these topics, these can help us some. So choreomusicology is something that a lot of people have embraced over this time period because they feel like it combines the study of music and dance. Another term that has been proposed is ethnochoreomusicology, which is a little bit, it's adding on this prefix of ethno. And ethno, really, in the field of ethnomusicology, ethno represented a type of research method, which is called ethnography, which is we'll get into a later presentation. But in this case, the word ethno represents the same kind of idea, not necessarily the beginning. Sometimes ethnology is a field of looking at the origins or the beginnings. And so in this case, it is also representing this research method. The terms binary separation refers to how academic specialists, either in their research methods or in their writings, where they're separating and creating them as two separate things. And of course, you can see where some people are going to argue for that they should not be separated, music or dance. Sometimes they really do fit together. And then the notion of disciplinary boundaries and gatekeepers. Let me unpack this a little bit. So sometimes in the academic disciplines, scholars and professors take a great deal of time defining what their field is. And not that it can't be challenged or grow or modify through the years, but there is an awful lot of effort in saying what a scholar in this discipline does and doesn't do. And this is really evident in the modern university system, where you have, like, for example, a music department, and then you might have an anthropology department that studies culture, where music studies music, whatever that means. There's philosophy departments. There's all kinds of departments, and people, specialize in these fields, but sometimes they really do take time to define what that discipline or what that field is going to address. And some people really function as gatekeepers. And this is why I chose to go to Indiana University for my ethnomusicology degree, because they were so much more open to multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary inquiry. And I was already coming to graduate school with a lot of interest in the relationship between music, dance, and theatrical components, and or even poetic dimensions of performance in Africa and Brazil. So Indiana University really presented this program where they were encouraged us to take classes in other departments and become competent in those other fields. Some other things I want us to think about is that sometimes when we research music and dance, it's important to know, are we looking at something that is staged? There's nothing wrong with that. Things that have been made for the stage or the theater or even concert music, versus other forms that are come out of different social processes that are not a concert setting. And so when I looked at dance a lot, it became important for me to become more familiar with dance types. And therefore, I want to share this with you as your teacher, that there are ceremonial or religious dance forms. There are social dances or dances for leisure. And those kinds right there show us that there are different reasons for dancing. And that also leads to the style or the character of those dances. There are actually all over the world this kind of category. They get different, get described differently. Sometimes they're called warrior dances or combat based dances, or even fighting style dances. So one example of that would be, we hear a lot about this in the African context, or there are some dances and songs that prepare people to either hunt or helped boost their morale, or women even sang songs in some African societies to send men off into battle. There's also capoeira in Brazil, which was a dance that was really a training in a martial art, but it was disguised as dance. So that would fit under that too. A little bit different category would be protest dances. A lot of these have showed up in South Africa, but other parts of the world as well. And then popular dances. Dances that you learn, like some of the social dances of the swing era in the United States, for example, the foxtrot, all the way up to club dances that we see today. So some dance forms are really truly grounded in social actions, and some of them are for individual expression, artistic expression, or both. There are certainly choreographed dances versus dance conventions that what this is going to represent is conventional ways to do like a folk dance, but maybe they have regional variations, or through time they get modified or changed, or they get combined with other dance forms. And so that would be those offshoots or those hybrids where a dance goes in a new direction. And salsa is another good dance form to think about this, because salsa has really taken off and blended with many other dance forms. And then again, there are this other category of dance, which is improvisatory or spontaneous, where people are responding to ideas and then creating a dance movement in the moment. So a little history of the scholarship here. So it's important, I'm going to move this up a little bit. to realize that people have been trying to include both music and movement when they do research and writing, and some of this really starts to emerge in the 1950s. Some of our first articulations in music scholarship that are combining these things start to show up, and obviously the field of anthropology was a large player in this, and the whole field of the anthropology of dance, which was really advocated by Anya Peterson Royce. The anthropology of music that started out by Alan Merriam, and before the anthropology of music was comparative musicology, where they were looking at music all over the world, but the presence of dance was still kind of marginalized in comparative musicology. And then of course ethnomusicology. So it's interesting that these three fields started to develop and become legitimized as academic disciplines around the time of the 1950s. So these are the strongest scholarly advocates or disciplinary advocates for including not only cultural social context when writing about music and dance, but combining the two. However, these studies were still rare. You don't see, it wasn't real common. Not all ethnomusicologists included dance, even if it was an important dimension of that music that they were looking at. So this interdependent relationship, in terms of being the focus of people's research, was still rare and intermittent. In the 1990s, there was a push of more scholars, especially trained music scholars. And again, they're still mostly ethnomusicologists, but also in the disciplines of performance studies and dance ethnology, to seriously consider this problem. Like, why are we separating these two fields? And they were bringing this to the attention of many scholarly communities, talking about it at professional society meetings. And I saw that happening in the field of ethnomusicology. There's actually a special group that has led the efforts in this direction. But sometimes these people are still seen as kind of odd. So we give a lot of credit to these scholars. They were very dedicated to their advocacy for the inclusion of dance or movement as they're looking at music. And they present their theories or approaches through various case studies. And this has led to new ideas for others to try. And so they have really paved the way. Looking at whenever we look at diverse musical expressions. So scholars also have struggled with, how do we talk about this relationship between music and dance? And these are some examples. Some people talk about sound in combination. They use this word in combination with movement or motion, or dance scholars dance in combination with music. They use this word combining. Okay, and what you're going to see is that some people really zoom in, and almost where there's none of this two side things. Sometimes they're just a cohesive whole. But other things, these are other things I've read in some of the scholarship. Congruent modes of expression. So the word of congruency is an interesting way to look at things. Musical gesture. Here you really are bringing in, they're being conflated is the best way to put it, where gesture has a musicality to it, or a musical line really has a gesture. Corporeality in music, which is, or embodied music interaction. This corporeality meaning that it's expressed through the body, or being embodied, how music is embodied. Music induced movement, or just simply music in the body, and how do we talk about that? So notice that the word movement or dance isn't there. So that kind of provides a broad model. And then an article I read recently by Colin Quigley on fiddle traditions in British Columbia, and how he uses this expression a lot, the shared domain of music and dance performance. So he's focusing on performance. How is this music performed? Not just, what is the structure of the music, but how is it performed? And in the music dance performance, this is particularly a shared domain. It's not one or the other that is privileged. These research projects also tend to focus on different things, which really I feel is where it really gets interesting. And this is what I want you to get out of this today, and how you can have different theoretical or different concepts to consider. So as these studies have tackled the issues, terminology and basic concepts and music dance relations, there have been an array of different research motivations or intentions which drive these differences. So I want you to look at, oops, sorry, I have a typo there. The variety of purpose that has produced these studies of interest, covering different aspects of sound movement relations, including dance that is accompanied by the dancer itself, so it doesn't need an instrumentalist. So there's this dance form in South Africa called gumboot dancing, where part of the dance is slapping the body, slapping the thighs and the ankles and the shins, and that the rhythm and the musicality is provided by the dancer as they're dancing. Some people have looked at musicians' movements in performance, like how are they bowing their fiddle in different ways, and how does that contribute to the musical sound? Another way is the analysis of music structures when they are for an accompaniment for dance versus when that music is not used for dance accompaniment. And they've done some comparative studies. And how is the music a little bit, how does it sound different? How is it phrased different? What is the melodic shape of that phrasing? Another direction would be, how do musicians influence dance for live events? And I would also wager that oftentimes in a lot of West African dance, traditional dance, there's a significant times where the dancer takes charge of how the music should go, either in tempo or a new shift to a different rhythm. I love this next one, the dialogic aspects between music and dance. What kind of interactions happen between the musician and the dancer? And that's a different focus here. You're looking mostly at where is that conversation happening and what does that look like? Also, the visual enhancement of music performance. What does dance provide, especially for the audience, or the drama inherent in a traditional music form? And there are many more angles to consider, and that you possibly could read about when you look at some of the scholarship. But all of these are going to deal with the dimension of music and movement, or music and sound. So these are some that I think are very important. What also has happened in this intellectual history of scholars is that as people get more specific about their studies, especially regional case studies or very genre specific studies, here is important people for us to know about. Kwabena Nketia, who is a scholar from Ghana, really led the way early on for ethnomusicology when he spoke about the interrelations of African music and dance. And I like this word, interrelations. And this was what led me to go to Indiana University, because I had read a lot of his work. And this just became so interesting to me that I could look at both dance and music. And it was just very vivacious and exciting for me to think about this field. Julian Gersten looks a lot at interaction and improvisation, which is a more of a in the moment, spontaneous kind of communication that happens. So it's in contrast to traditional dance that is highly structured versus improvisatory forms of music and dance. Tommy Han wrote about the learning processes, like how do you learn this traditional Japanese dance form? That what Tommy Han noticed was that music and movement were even if you were a dancer, you had to master both the music and the dance at the same time, which shows us how they are not separate. And you should know, in some cultures, they don't have separate words like music and dance. They have one word that represents the cohesive whole. And then Greg Downey's work in 2002 wrote about capoeira and did a really interesting job of showing how the mover embodies the sounds and vice versa, how the sounds really are very specific to movement. The sounds on the bierumbau, this very musical bow instrument, doesn't exist separate from movement. I mean, it was conceived through the art of moving. And then what happens to the perceptions of the capoeira artist as they are performing the music and the singing and the moving. So he's got a really great um, body of writing on this. So just another example, this is just continued, is O. Rostrom in 1999 chose to take the gaze off the music or the dance and instead to look at a very particular social event, something that occurs like a community festival or um, some other kind of event, and talks about how you can go from the center of that event outward, and therefore the musical structures or the dance moves per se are not the focus but this event. And so that would include other dimensions as well as music and movement. But like a friend of mine said, it isn't all about the 16th notes, right? We really do have to broaden our gaze when we think about music creation, music performance, and this reception of musical sound, the audience or the listener. And so O. Ronstrom wrote a lot about tango, and this is one of the chapters. It takes two or more to tango. And then it is in this publication, Dance in the Field, Theory, Methods, and Issues in Dance Ethnography. So other factors, one more, which I think is very interesting, is how do we deal with the spiritual realm? If a dancer is, it's the job of the dancer is to embody spirits. How do we account for the dance of the spirits in some religious traditions? And so Filippo Bonini Beraldi talks about the aspect of transformation of body behaviors or corporeal behaviors through music. And so, how does music change body behavior? And this is completely in relation to non human, invisible entities that in the belief systems are really embodying the dancer. It isn't the individual dancer, the trained dancer per se, but it is the spirit dancing through a human body, such as Brazilian candomblé or Romanian gypsy communities. Okay, and then regarding ways to notate or ways to analyze this relationship, this shared domain, you should know there have been really some interesting studies that if you become interested in this, usually notation in this sense is used to analyze and not teach people how to perform, and which we call that descriptive notation, not prescriptive. And so there is a form of dance notation out there called Laban notation. It came from the German modern dance movement. And it, it's a highly technical system. Not very many dancers use it or know how to use it, but it was originally developed to preserve very important modern dances so they would not be forgotten. In a way, before film capture, video capture, it was used as a notation. And this notation is interesting because it can account for not just rhythmic beats, but it accounts for directions in space, the weight of the body versus the lightness or the levity of the. There are symbols that can, when they're combined, can communicate all these different aspects of a modern dance. So anyway, this is interesting possibility. I know some ethnomusicologists that have experimented with using this form of notation with music notation. But there are a lot of people who use computer technology as well to combine ways of analyzing the relationship between music and dance. So these are just some resources to introduce you to the introductory article I got from this edition. You should know that there are two editions to this. Choreology in the World of Music. There's a volume 1 and a volume 2. And volume 1 deals a lot with social cultural things and corporeality. The volume 2 deals a lot with translocality, which is how do we deal with dance forms and music influences that come from across different locales, and also how do we deal with the local, the communities of practice. And that's those kinds of frameworks I am the most familiar with because that's what I've used in my own research. And so I just want to point your attention to that when we look at diverse musics. I heavily advocate for finding out how they might talk about this relationship, how the practitioners or communities of practice. So this term communities of practice is something I will share with you later in another lecture, but this is not my term that I coined, but there's a whole theoretical model that underpins this. But anyway, it just to introduce it to you briefly here, that as we spend time with communities of practice, how do we do that? Well, one way, of course, is to do field work and to ask the practitioners themselves. But if we're doing lighter studies that are not like at the PhD level, we might lend ourselves to reading works by ethnomusicologists who have done their work in the field, because they're going to capture those perspectives from local practitioners. Let's see, I'll point your attention down at the bottom of the slide. This is another book, edited volume called Music-Dance, Sound and Motion in Contemporary Discourse by Patrizia Veroli and Gianfranco Vinet. This is published by Routledge in 2018. Another source that I would have you consider is Dance in the Field, Theory, Methods, and Issues in Dance Ethnography by Teresa Buckland, who is the editor, and there's chapters in this book written by different scholars. And this is important because it's bringing together some of the strongest thinking that came from North America and Eastern and Western Europe. It's one of the first collections for that. And then another collection is the Routledge Companion to Embodied Music Interaction in 2017. And this is looking at new paradigms in the study of music interaction. It has more recent research than the previous edition I pointed out. And then this is one of the most recent books that I think would be very interesting to read, written by the same author of the article that I based this presentation on. And her work is called Perspectives in Motion, Engaging the Visual in Dance and Music. And so she's focusing on visual approaches to performance in global cultural contexts. And she also gets into some of the pioneers like Adrian Kepler, who's very important to this field of study. So that's all I have for you. I hope you enjoyed that, and more later. Thanks. Bye-bye.